this next topic is around HIV and ICD-10-CM codes. The specific question that we received was actually one we answered back in August, but it's one that we get so frequently, and it's one that I have seen all over social media in the last month or so. And it's regarding, on the HIV codes, when do you use the Z code versus the B code? And would you code the patient as being active if they have a history of HIV? Well, when we start looking at the AIDS and HIV codes, when we originally received this question, it came in asking, okay, when do we use that V code versus when do we use the 042 in ICD-9? So we wanted to update it for ICD-10. Lorraine, can you click the link?
I did. It's not showing?
Nope, I'm still seeing the slide. I mean, I can still talk through it. There we go. Okay. So I'm reiterating a lot of the information that Tammy and Alicia covered when they covered this topic back in August, but I kind of looked at it from a little bit different perspective, and you'll find I'm huge on citing my sources, so I wanted to give you where I found the information that helped me make my decision and when do I use the Z code, the Z21 versus the B20. When we first start looking at HIV, the important thing to understand here is that a patient at this point in time cannot have a history of HIV. It's not possible. We do not yet have a cure for HIV. Once a patient has HIV, they have HIV for life. From a coding perspective, it simply becomes, do they have symptomatic HIV or do they have asymptomatic HIV? So if we'll scroll down a little bit farther, we're going to talk about how do we figure out what constitutes asymptomatic, which is the Z21, versus what constitutes symptomatic, which is our B20. Okay, it was funny because when we were looking at our answer sheets earlier today, Alicia goes, I love this little timeline thingy. How do you get that? And I said, the CDC's website. Because that's actually where this came from. What I did is, if you didn't know this, the federal government, our federal government here in the United States, has a website devoted to AIDS and HIV because it is so, for years, was so rampant, and it's still a very large thing that we have to deal with. They actually estimate that up to 18% of the population that has HIV has no idea they have HIV because they're asymptomatic. So what they explain is that there's really 3 stages of HIV. There's the acute infection point where the person first gets infected and their body, it's a virus, right? So it's replicating constantly. That's that acute infection time frame. And usually they might have some flu-like symptoms. Okay, it's going to be a bad flu. It's not going to be oh, that was a piece of cake. But that's kind of all the more they're going to get. They're not going to know. It's not going to be any abnormal, crazy, oh, I must have HIV, that's what this is. Then they fall into a period of what we call clinical latency. And that means that the virus is just there, doing its thing, replicating, not making them sick, but continuing to spread throughout their bloodstream. Okay, it's reproducing at a lower level than that initial thing, but it's still considered active infection. Both of these, we're still talking about an asymptomatic patient. They have not yet had a symptom related to their HIV. And when we talk about symptoms related to their HIV, the CDC actually defines AIDS as saying, okay, their CD4 cells fall below 200 cells, and that's when it's progressed to AIDS. They actually go on, if you'll scroll up a little bit farther, Lorene, they go up to explain that it's not just about the CD4 blood counts. It's actually about whether or not a patient has had what we call an OI, or an opportunistic infection. Okay? Those first 2 stages, the acute infection, the clinical latency, we don't have any symptoms associated with those. Yeah, they kind of thought they had the flu, but it's not necessarily a symptomatic, it's not an opportunistic infection. So when we start looking through here, the guidelines actually say, okay, well, if they've not had a symptom of HIV, they're asymptomatic. And usually the provider is going to call this, they're going to say HIV positive, known HIV. They have a history of an HIV positive test. Okay. The important thing to note here is this is not when the provider uses the phrase AIDS, and it is not, and I did not put this in this note, but this was a question that I have had people ask me as I've done trainings. This is not if a provider writes the word ARC, A-R-C. ARC stands for the AIDS-related complex. And that's actually, a lot of providers in the infectious disease world will call it ARC when the patient is first beginning to experience an opportunistic infection, which is an HIV-related illness. You'll notice both of these guidelines for symptomatic and asymptomatic all around revolve around, has the patient had, either currently or in the past, an HIV-related illness. If they've had an HIV-related illness, they get coded as symptomatic HIV. So if you'll scroll up a little bit farther, Lorene, or down a little bit farther, however you want to think of that. Okay. The AIDS.gov website goes on to explain an HIV-related illness is this opportunistic infection, sometimes referred to as an OI. And that AIDS.gov web address actually says, okay, there are 20 opportunistic infections that by default, if you have a patient with known HIV that has, or since the time of their diagnosis with HIV, has had one of these conditions, they have full-blown AIDS, period. The end. Once they have AIDS for the rest of their life. Once they go from that Z21, that asymptomatic status, to having an opportunistic infection, they move into the B20 world. They stay in that B20 world for life, even if we treat that opportunistic infection and it goes away. Things like, if you'll scroll a little farther up, it'll give you that full list of the 20. Okay? And when we talk about opportunistic infections, these are things that take advantage of the patient's weakened immune system. I think about it as it's going to take a patient nearly to death's door, and it could potentially be fatal for them. If we start looking at these, think about this, right? Candidiasis of the bronchi, the trachea, the lungs, the esophagus. That's a fungal infection down in there. A patient with AIDS or with HIV has a compromised immune system. They're not going to be able to fight off these infections as well as a normal healthy patient would. So by definition, if a patient has HIV and they have, or since the time of their diagnosis, have had one of these 20 conditions, they have AIDS. They have full-blown AIDS. The most common question I get is, well, the doctor didn't call it AIDS. Well, if the doctor documents known HIV and in the history it says, history of, invasive cervical cancer. At a bare minimum, you need to be querying the provider and going, okay, was that before or after their HIV diagnosis? Is it related? Because if it's related, that patient has AIDS. They should be reported using a B20. And that's one of the things I see most frequently. I see a lot of coders go, well, the doctor didn't say that, the doctor just said this. It comes down to understanding the disease process and knowing these different pieces to know what to look for in the record. Because, yeah, the doctor may have said down here, HIV positive, but in the history they may have said HIV positive, with a history of histoplasmosis. Well, I got news. Histoplasmosis is almost always HIV related. So you need to know when to ask the questions of your providers. And by asking those questions, you're going to begin to, I know this sounds funny, but you're going to begin to train those providers as to what needs to be there when they're diagnosing AIDS and HIV. Another common question I get is, okay, well, what if our doctor doesn't know that they've had one of these opportunistic infections and just writes HIV positive and I code it as a Z21? We already have that problem with the ICD-9 codes, or we did before we went to ICD-10. The same process is likely to occur. If you're not familiar with that process, when you report those codes to the insurance company, they're looking at their files. And they're going, oh, but we show that this patient actually has AIDS. And more than likely what happens is you get a letter from the insurance company saying, well, according to our records, this is a patient with full-blown AIDS. Please please verify your documentation so that you know, oh, well, we need to get clarification from the patient or from the patient's past medical records, but it looks like we need to adjust our diagnosis because they don't really just have HIV, they have full-blown AIDS. Okay? And oftentimes it's that the provider doesn't know the nuances and the differences from a coding perspective. Because remember, coding and clinical don't always match 100%. We've got to come to that common language and explain how it's different from a coding perspective. So for AIDS and HIV, when we talk about B20 and Z21, it's all about, are they symptomatic or asymptomatic, which comes down not to their blood cell counts, but have they had an opportunistic infection or a HIV-related illness?
And just a few clarifying questions that came in. So Lena's asking, if the patient is being treated for a cancer, we don't need to report their HIV status?
I would disagree with that statement. Every insurance company, and actually the coding rules, the way that they have always been explained to me, and even if you look in the ICD-9 guidelines, or I'm sorry, the ICD-10 guidelines, HIV is the only condition that is considered to always be clinically significant. It's expected to be reported on every encounter for every provider that sees that patient from the time of diagnosis until the time they expire, because it does factor into so many things, and there's such a high risk around transmission that is the one disease that they track extremely closely. So I would encourage you to report it on any HIV patient that you see.
All right. And then Debbie said, so HIV is either asymptomatic or symptomatic, no personal history of?
Correct.
Okay.
Because we can't cure it yet.
And then Candy said, I've always heard that if the patient has HIV in their past history, you always have to code for HIV. Is that true?
Yes. Because again, HIV never goes away. And at this point in time, it can't be cured. It can be controlled with medications, especially if we catch it in the asymptomatic phase. But once they have HIV, because like I said, because we don't have a cure yet, they have HIV for life. And it's the one condition that's always considered clinically significant. So it needs to be reported anytime that patient is seen. The order simply changes depending on why they're there. If you have a patient coming in, and this goes back to the ICD-10 guidelines, right? Those Chapter 1 guidelines. If you have a patient coming in for an HIV-related illness, right? Maybe they're coming in for histoplasmosis. Maybe they're coming in for a Kaposi sarcoma. Those are things that are inherently HIV-related. The guidelines tell you, okay, the HIV has to go first. If they're coming in for something completely unrelated, maybe they sprain their ankle, right? Oh, I sprained my ankle, I need to take a look at my ankle, but oh, by the way, they find out during the intake, this patient is HIV positive. They don't have AIDS, they have HIV, or even if they did have AIDS. That still needs to be reported, but the main reason they were there was the ankle sprain. The HIV would be kind of an oh, by the way, at the end that would get put on there.
Do you need more medical certification training? Go to www.cco.us. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for updates.